Hello everyone. Today we will discuss and demonstrate vectors and arrays in C++ with a series of tutorial videos. There will be two different program concepts. We will show how the programs run when using either a vector or an array. Before we begin our discussion, we would like to cite our sources. All information and material used in this presentation was derived from Chapter 6 of the textbook Big C++, 2nd edition by Cay Horstmann and Timothy Budd. A vector is a collection of data items of the same type. Every element of the collection can be accessed separately. Like vectors, arrays collect elements of the same type. Once the size of an array has been set, it cannot be changed. If you are writing a program which needs to collect multiple elements of the same data type, a vector or an array should always be used rather than creating many independent variables. Vectors and arrays will allow you to easily store and access all your elements. Although vectors and arrays are very similar, there are some slight differences between the two. Here are some to name a few. Array parameters are always passed by reference. The return type of a function cannot be an array. On the contrary, these rules do not apply to vectors. The setup for creating vectors and arrays is an obvious difference. But their most prevalent difference would be that you cannot resize an array after its initial size has been determined, but you can do this with vectors. Also, the size of the array must be known when it is first created. However, this is not the case with vectors. For this reason, it is often simpler and far more convenient to use vectors as opposed to arrays. So, why do people still use arrays? The reason is that vectors were a recent addition to C++, and many older programs use arrays instead. Therefore, arrays are still an important topic in C++. Arrays are also faster and more efficient than vectors. This can be important in some applications. At any rate, having a deep knowledge of both vectors and arrays is essential for an experienced C++ programmer. We will begin the tutorials with a basic program which will ask the user to input an integer value for height and width. These inputted values will then be tested in a series of loops. It will use an array to store multiple characters which will then be used in our loops. When finished, the program should output the array's elements which will then display a square with mathematical symbols. Let's begin by writing our obligatory lines of code. #include input-output stream. This array will be holding multiple characters, and thus we will need to include a string header file and then lastly, using namespace standard and the integer main function. Let's proceed to create our array. The type of elements this array will hold will be characters, and thus we will make it a string type. We will name our array square. As previously mentioned, the size of an array must be declared at the time it is created. So then, we will now determine the size of our array. We want 3 different character outputs, thus the size of our array will be 3. Note that the slots in arrays are numbered starting at 0, therefore the last number we can access will actually be 2 and not 3. The 3 characters we have chosen to display our square are the greater than, plus, and less than symbols. Next, let's create variables for the height and width values of the square. They will be integers and we will call them square height and square width. Now, let's write code that will ask and allow the user to input their desired height and width values. Our array is finished and now we can use its elements to display a square. But first we must create a nested for loop. This loop will add elements into our array until it has been filled to the numbers that were previously inputted by the user. We want our loop to start at 1, so we will create an integer called width and initialize it to 1. Next we will see if the width is less than or equal to the square height, and if so, we will add 1 unit to our square. Then we add an if statement to test whether the width is less than or equal to 1. We must add another for loop. This time, however, we must see if the width is less than or equal to the square width. If so, our variable width is incremented by 1 unit. The first element in our array, square, 0, which is a greater than symbol, is then outputted by each increment. Next, we add an else if statement to our nested loop that tests whether the variable width is less than the square height. This deals with the element in slot 1 in the first row of the square. Again, we add another for loop as well as an if-else statement that takes care of the units in both columns of the square. This time, we create a variable named width2 and our if statement tests whether width2 is equal to 1 or if width2 is equal to square width. If so, it will display in square 1, which is the plus symbol in the second slot in our array. We also add some blank text so that there can be space between the two columns. Finally, we add our last for loop that completes our square by filling in the units of the bottom row. We repeat the same process as before, naming our variable width3 this time. The output will be square 2, which is the less than symbol in the third slot of our array. All elements in our array have now been utilized in order to display our square. We have now finished our first program. Let's compile and run it to see what our square looks like first when the height is 15 and the width is 30. Then a second time when the height is 50 and the width is 100.
Greetings all, my name is Edwin and I am with the group of Felipe, Mario, and Wesley. Today I am going to show you a simple example of a vector in C++. A very general definition of a vector is that it is a collection of data items of the same type. Every element of the collection can be accessed separately. This program's task is pretty basic. It will require you to input two integer values for height and width. It should output a square. So here we included a basic library of hashtag include less than iostream greater than hashtag include less than vector greater than and hashtag include less than string greater than. As you may see here, we used a declared vector of strings with 3 elements. 3 is the size of our vector. The 3 characters we have choose to display the square at the greater than, plus, less than symbols. Now we created variables for the height and width values of the square. They are integers and we called them square height and square width. This code allows the user to input the desired dimensions for the height and width values. Here we created a for loop, which is a repetition control structure that helps and allows one to efficiently write a loop that needs to be executed a specific number of times. So now let's compile this simple vector program. As you may see, we may enter the desired dimensions for the height and width of the square and it should output a square. And this is basically it. Pretty straightforward. Thank you for your attention. May the force be with you.
Good morning, class. I'm Mario Pinzon. My group is made up of Wesley, Edwin, and Felipe. Let's not waste any time and dive right in. Today we will be going over a tutorial of a program which shows a class's grade percentages and which is the highest grade. First, the user is asked to enter the total points out of 500. Then it divides each input by 500 and multiplies by 100 to get a percentage. After it returns the percentages as they were entered and shows which grade is the highest. To declare a vector, we need to include a vector. First, we declare our vector and our data type, which is double. We name it score. Int I will be the scores entered by the user. This prompt will come up once the program starts. We set up our Boolean variable called more and initialize it to true. Then we make a while loop. Next we enter the conditions. Z is going to be the scores inputted after the prompt shows up. If z equals 0, then more is false and the while loop starts over. If it is greater than 0, then it continues. We add values to the vector by using pushback. We use this method to add the element to the vector from the end of the vector. We add a value of z, so the first value of this vector will be z. Next, we create a variable with a double type and we call it highest. We then set it equal to the first slot in the vector, score 0. To access the values in the vector, we use a for loop. We can access the value using the square brackets and the index. This is how we figure out which score is the highest. We use a for loop and turn the scores into percentages by dividing the scores entered by 500 and multiplying them by 100. It then assigns the highest grade to score I and outputs it. Once the code is written, we have now completed the program. We then compile and run it to see if everything works. Good morning.
Okay, on this tutorial I'll be showing you how to calculate the highest percentage program using arrays. As first off, just to not jump the gun here, we will set our integer, unsigned integer k, as how many slots we're going to put in an array first. Then we're going to start our counter, as we can see right here, to calculate how much values we're going to be putting into the arrays. Then right here we already set our high score and our low score from -500 to 500. The reason why 500, because our maximum score is going to be at 500. Anything above that will not count, and that's what we have our counter for, to prevent that, permitting that to go inside of our array. And anything below 0 will also not be counted. So on this step, let me show you guys how to complete this program. So first off, if any number outside of that domain range of 500 will not be counted, this is how you would perform that. Counts is greater than 500, or array 1 is less than 0. Alright, so let's see what happens. So let's put cout, please. Oops, man, typing too fast. So our counts will not consider that. Let's see out counts will not consider that value. So count -1, array 1, counts that bracket right now. So the next one is setting our number to end the program by entering 0. Not entering the program, sorry, exiting the while loop. So array count sorry, to 0. Then we'll break out of it. So break. So next up, now we're going to set the if statements for the highest and lowest scores. So if array 1, oops, excuse me, error, put that 1, oops, 1, is greater than that high score, then our high score will equal that array with that value. So each score will equal that array with that value. And let's copy this and do the same for the low score. It has to be less than low score, and low score will be set into that array. Then our count function, or not count function, count variable will increase every time we put in a value inside of array. And on this point right here, we will get our highest grade value to print out. Now let's see if this could run. So let's save this. Now let's save this. And I made a mistake here. I think I left out a bracket. Let's see if it's the problem. No, it's not. So see what my mistake is real quick. Okay, I made 2 mistakes so far. So on this one, I forgot to use the count, and there was a bracket missing. Now let's run our program, see what we get. So first off, let's just put on 500 and 501, and see, that will not count. So let's put 600, that will not count, and -2, that will not count. Now let's put values that are less than 500 or equal to 500 from 0 to 500. So 20, 340, and 450. And let's exit that. Highest returning grade is 100 due to that 500. It is not recognized 501, 600, or -2, so you will not see 120% for the 600, and -2 will be some other value. So yeah, that's it.